Time begins on my first word. We negate contention when it's disinformation. GPC is needed to counter Russian influence, which is important because USDS finds that if disinformation is Russia's most important weapon, and Russia has encouraged the development of a disinformation propaganda ecosystem, which creates and spreads false narratives to advance the Kremlin's policy goals. In fact, Darby 19 finds that Russia had depressed black voter turnout by posting racist propaganda. More than 66% of propaganda was posted by Russia was related to race. That's why Darby 19 furthers that the 2016 election was the first time in 20 years that black voter turnout dropped, falling significantly from 66% to 59%. Lack of voting rights means lack of representation, leading to policymakers ignoring their needs. Unfortunately, Rodriguez 16 finds that excess mortality is effective political processes. There were 2.7 million excess black deaths. Contention 2 is authoritarian regimes, as Walsh 21 finds that the world is a long democratic recession with democracy worsening in 73 countries. The U.S. is responsible for this global democratic backsliding. And Brennan and Jackson 22 find that competition compels the U.S. to make undemocratic promises. An anti-China, anti-Russian agenda justifies U.S. backing despotic leaders from Turkey to the Philippines and beyond. Unfortunately, Falkor 17 finds that oppressive regimes killed more than 100 million people. Contention 3 is Russia. GPC is the reason behind the Ukraine invasion. Partner 22 finds that the invasion of Ukraine is not imperialism, it is great power politics. Russia would be willing to live with the neutral Ukraine. It isn't necessary for Moscow to have control over Ukraine. They just want a regime that is not pro-American. Additionally, it gives Russia a reason to justify its invasion of Ukraine, as Trumpland 22 finds that Russia accuses the West of waging a proxy war against it by hammering its economy with sanctions and stepping up the supply of advanced weapons to Ukraine. Russia doesn't reject peace talks. The further the war goes, the harder it will be to negotiate. There are two implications. First is chemical weapons. Passengers 22 finds that Russia may launch a chemical weapons attack in Ukraine. Russia has used chemical weapons during past conflicts in Chechnya and Syria. This is likely, as Borger 22 find that Russia could be setting the stage to use a chemical weapon in Ukraine. And Russia had made false claims about U.S. chemical weapons development in Ukraine, and Russia has a track record of accusing the West of the very violations that Russia itself is perpetuating. Crucially, Topaz 07 finds that the use of chemical weapons is seen as means of genocide. Second is nuclear escalation. Russia will be willing to use nukes. At Falkenberg and Osborne 22 finds that Putin warned that he's ready to use nuclear weapons to defend Russia amid the war in Ukraine. He believes that nuclear weapons might work for his purposes to reverse the situation, frighten the West, and give him out of the bind he is in. This is because Lothar 22 finds that Russia sees the use of nuclear weapons as a means to de-escalate a conflict, which would be devastating, as Miko 21 finds that 1.44 million people could lose their lives due to radioactive fallout from a single nuclear weapon. And even worse, Star 15 finds that a nuclear winter would cause humans to die from nuclear famine in a mass extinction. Contention 4 is Chinese cooperation. Subpoint 8 is pandemics. Currently, Pen 21 finds that the risk of intense outbreak is growing rapidly, and the probability of novel disease outbreaks will grow threefold in the next few decades because of population growth, changes in food systems, and environmental degradation. Unfortunately, Ross 20 finds that inadequate U.S.-China cooperation leads to lack of greater government transparency following discoveries of new diseases to allow early responses and encourage scientists to cooperate on containing the spread of illness. That's why Wright 21 finds that competition with China would only guarantee future pandemics. To quantify, Samuel 19 finds that a pandemic would kill 80 million people, and Kerbal 21 finds that a pandemic would force 490 million people into poverty. Subpoint B is climate change, as Vanessa 21 finds that China and the US are responsible for nearly 50% of all global emissions. Fortunately, Law 22 finds that China and the US agreed to deal to cut emissions at the climate change talks last year. This is crucial, as USDS 21 finds that the US and China's commitment aim in accordance to limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, GPC prevents future agreements like these from even taking place in the first place. As Yang 22 finds that Western democracies want cooperation with Beijing, but it hasn't been easy given the growing competition and deepening mistrust. And as climate cooperation between Washington and Beijing has become harder. That's when Robinson Chomsky 22 finds that China broke off talks with the US about climate change, and that's really important, as Duke 18 finds that 153 million deaths linked to air pollution could be avoided if nations limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Further, Hollingsworth 19 finds that climate change will pose existential threat to human civilization. Over 1 billion people will be displaced, thus being decay.
Time starts now. We proudly affirm GPC is a competition for all the great powers of the world, specifically Russia, the US, and China competing for top dog. On our case, contention 1 is African affairs. Africa is crucial to the world's survival. Stephen Townsend explains that Africa has 13 of the 25 fastest growing economies of the world. Africa has 60% of arable land on the globe and also has an abundance of materials that are critical to 21st century progress. GPC helps Africa, as French 2022 writes that the GPC is healthy for Africa. The competition benefits the country by forcing each side to offer the very best. Subpoint A is saving lives. African countries are unable to access the tools necessary to containing national epidemics and producing their own supplies. But the GPC solves, as an investment has increased, and a new report finds that investing $1 per person per year could save 7 million lives. Subpoint B is ending poverty and structural violence. GPC results in the growth of GDP due to the fact that the gross domestic product in Africa has risen more than twice its pace in the 21st century. This has caused poverty reduction and reduced structural violence. Peter Fry states that As GDP increases, money is put back into infrastructure to reducing poverty. This proves that GDP reduces poverty and structural violence, which happens as a result of poverty. Subpoint B is green energy. Investments in renewable energy are increasing rapidly in Africa as renewable investments globally rose 9% from 2020 to 2021, and the global transition of fossil fuels to clean energy has the potential to benefit economies and health across Africa. Sustainable renewable energy is fundamental to Africa's future, as that's what's increased investment from GPC, and the world will not be able to meet global sustainable development and climate commitment without it. Contention 2 is nuclear proliferation. The US's strategy in the GPC is a nuclear umbrella, and that's what's essentially holding the entire world together. US allies trust the American nuclear umbrella, and the nuclear umbrella is vital for alliance reassurance and for maintaining strong relationships. However, without the US nuclear umbrella, other countries will proliferate. The impact is extinction. Proliferation is detrimental and would lead to extinction. Koenig of Georgetown University elaborates that the proliferation of nuclear weapons increases instability, as nations often proliferate in snowballs. When one nation attains nuclear weapons, it's incentivizing surrounding nations to proliferate as well for security. Moreover, Thera 18 of East Chicago finds that rapidly nuclearizing states often cut corners, making inadvertent launches likely. Koenig 15 writes that new nuclear states go through a transition period in which they lack second strike capabilities. This means that new nuclear states are more willing to use nukes because they have weaker military capabilities, which increases the probability of nuclear exchanges, which, Star 15 writes, could result in massive amounts of chemical and radioactive toxins being released into the biosphere, which would cause most humans and animals to die from nuclear famine and essentially lead to extinction. Contention 3 is on soft power. In the status quo, the US is seen as a global force in terms of soft power and influence. The GPC prevents the undermining of the US as it pushes the US to see Russia and China as a threat. Subpoint A is voting. Russian misinformation in the 2016 election targeted Black voters. Bulk 19 quantifies that over 2/3 of all Russian misinformation contained terms related to race. This dramatically reduced the turnout of Black voters. The impact is dire. People who don't vote aren't represented, leading policymakers to ignore their needs. Brown 15 writes, 1 in 3 deaths of African Americans between 1970 and 2004 would have been prevented if they had equal access to education, healthcare, and public services. If they vote at the same rate as white people, he quantifies that 2.7 million African Americans would still have been alive today. However, GPC solves as the US increased cyber defense and Russia failed to mount any major hacking or disinformation operations and interfere in the 2020 presidential election. Subpoint B is cyber defense. China's cyber capabilities pose a serious threat to the US. However, the US is solving as it works on exposing China's use of criminal contract hackers to conduct unsanctioned cyber operations globally and increasing cyber defense. The investment in cyber defense results in many advantages. Miller 21 finds that the investment in cybersecurity also benefits US firms. Projections estimate that the US government will increase spending on cybersecurity, and improved cybersecurity is investment that is sure to pay off in the long term. The economic cost of information and technology asset security breaches years ago was a staggering $4 to $6 trillion, equivalent to about 4 to 6% of the global GDP. Thus, we affirm an affirmative ballot.
Cool. So can I have the first question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so how does the US aid Africa with green tech? Does it give money, or what does it exactly do?
We're saying that both the US and China are increasing investment in Africa, and as a result of that, green energy tech in Africa is blossoming, and
What do you mean increase investment in Africa? So do they give them money, or do they give them what?
So both the US has been giving supplies to increase investments in green tech, and I think both China and the US have both provided money.
Okay, yeah, sure. You can have a question then.
Okay. Just as a clarification question, first of all, what's your tagline for your second contention?
Cool. Our second contention was authoritarian regimes.
Okay, great. And then that was just your tagline, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Those. Okay. Wait. Can I have another question then?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So how exactly does GPC solve this black voter turnout thing that you guys talk about in your C3? Your 2016 thing, wasn't that during GPC when black voter turnout dropped?
Yeah, we're saying okay, since 2016 was one of the earlier years of GPC, we're saying that in these past 7 years we're seeing an immense amount of GPC helping Because especially since since the U.S. sees China and Russia as a threat, we're saying in the past like 7 years, cyber defense has increased as like a direct result of GPC. So these past 7 years of GPC is the time frame that we're looking at.
Cool. I'm gonna need a card for like I'm gonna need a card for how like GPC increases Black voter turnout directly, but yeah, you can have a question if you want. So.
Okay, Kaylin can send that card, I think. I don't really have a question. Let me know if you have another.
Okay, yeah, sure. Then okay. So on your okay, so on cyber defense, like why is it direct, like what's the link exactly so that GPC directly causes like cyber investment? Like doesn't the US always have cyber investment?
The U.S. does have cyber investment, yes, but we're saying the GPC is increasing cyber investment, or sorry, cyber defense specifically, because we talk about how like China's cyber capabilities are threatening the U.S. and they're stealing cyber. Okay, do you want me to finish up?
Yeah, sure, you can finish up.
We're just saying that China's cyber capabilities are increasing and posing a threat to the U.S. due to GPC, and because of that, the U.S. has increased investment. So this is all a direct link because of GPC. So like, yeah.
Going to the first contention in Africa. First of all, we link in from global pandemics. Global pandemics pushed 55 million people into poverty in Africa. Even so, let's consider three responses first off. First of all, non-unique because Run 25 and US is supplying aid to countries since the middle of the 20th century when there was no strategy of GPC because we're the only hegemony. With that said, we were still assisting other countries without GPC, meaning that you see their impacts happen in both worlds. But then second, we tell you that the reason why the US has other incentives for this aid to Africa is because according to Ingram 19, finds that a substantial majority of polls supporting according to working collaborating, which is why the US always has incentive to help out other countries. But even if you don't buy that, we tell you that this aid that US is giving to Africa is really, really bad because WSJ22 finds that money from US has trapped many African nations in a cycle of corruption, slower economic growth, and poverty, cutting off the flow of beef far more beneficial. This is because the U.S. gives, as they tell you, the U.S. gives Africa money. They don't give Africa, they don't give Africa money to every single person in Africa. They give the money to the government. This is really bad because the quantified impact on Africa is overall giving money to each person. However, the U.S. isn't giving money to each person. It's giving money to governments. And we're telling you that when these corrupt governments get them, they ultimately don't help the people inside Africa. They only help themselves, which is why Africa's economy is only going worse and people are going more into poverty. With that said, that's why onto green investment on their link specifically, they give me this link about how there's like a 9% increase from 2020 to 2021. When the next line literally says that renewables investment in Africa slipped 35% year on year. At this point, they literally, their own card goes against them. They tell you that like it's only from 2020 to 2021, but at this point right now it's decreasing because currently the corrupt governments are only get the money. But then we'll tell you there's many other reasons why like the U.S. aid to Africa is only for their own interest, for our own competition, like against other countries like China, Russia. With absent competition, we'll probably more likely be able to try to like actually invest more into Africa and like the places where they actually need. But then at the point where their green investment is like going against them, the Russia, but then also the graph says that there's a decrease in investment starting from 2014, and as recent, that means that the U.S. is decreasing investment on Africa. With that, so let's go to your second contention, proliferation. First of all, their contention is not unique because before great power competition, U.S. still has security umbrellas over the allies. CRS 21 finds that after the Cold War, America was the only superpower, meaning there's no great power competition. But even so, then as the greatest world superpower and there's no great power competition, the U.S. still maintained a strong security umbrella over many allies, including South Korea and Japan post-Cold War. But the second, we tell you that GPC strategy makes allies more likely to proliferate. The reason is because when the U.S. increases competition, the competitors' goals such as Russia and China have tried their goals to influence harm to the U.S., but it does so by threatening and targeting the allies according to CRS 21. At this point, the allies are trying to defend themselves, and that's why Japan and like South Korea have purposely like voiced themselves out that they want to like proliferate. But even so, we'll tell you that allies proliferation is good because nuclear weapons make the world safer. The world would be safer if more countries have nuclear weapons because proliferation causes like mutually assured destruction, which nuclear wars encourages both defense and deterrence, according to Wells 2017. But then let's go to their final contention on soft power. First of all, turn at the top of their contention, a large part of AI development would entail collaboration, to the point where before great power competition, none of their impacts existed, but when their own evidence is happening during great power competition. Notice when the evidence happened in 2016. Great power competition existed in 2016. They told their black voter turnout decreased in 2016. What does this mean? This proves that great power competition doesn't work in terms of preventing these cyber attacks from occurring, and it doesn't work in terms of helping black voter turnout. At this point, we tell you 3 reasons why this is true. Sure, because this is the misinformation retelling case. George Hinchey tells you that the World War III happened through cyberspace as a result of conflict boosting up. This always impact because we're linking to World War III right there, where they don't have any single quantified impact. But second, the U.S. has always had an incentive to boost the cyber defense to protect themselves, which means that that's why the U.S. did that after the Cold War, when there's no great power competition, the U.S. always wants to protect itself. But in third, we tell that cyber attacks are not lethal because they don't really have an exact impact. At the point where they're basically using our impact when we're telling you that right now great power competition is happening, they don't have any impact. Therefore, we urge a negative ballot.
Time starts on my first word. On my opponent's first contention about disinformation, we tell you this is non-unique because Russia began propaganda in 1917, and coming out of underground movements, the Soviets prepared to begin publishing Pravda. The very first Soviets passed assuming power was to suppress the newspapers that opposed them, and so even without GPC, it was without GPC when the Russian propaganda began. We also turn this because we tell you that the great power competition allows the U.S. to defend against this misinformation. Their alternative is worse. On the second contention about authoritarianism, we tell you that the alternative to the great power competition with Russia and China is a global autocracy, as the struggle between the U.S. and its rivals, Russia and China, is a contest between two alternative logics of world order. The U.S. defends an international order that is open, multilateral, and anchored in security pacts and partnerships with other liberal democracies, while China and Russia seek an international order that dethrones Western liberal values and one that is more hospitable to autocracy. And despite the drawbacks, the alternative to U.S. hegemony is Russia and China dominance. And if Americans learn anything from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it should be that there are things worse than the U.S. hegemony. And the third contention about Russia and Ukraine would tell you that protracted occupation parts of Ukrainian territory threatens to sap Russian military manpower and reduce the modernized weapons arsenal, with consequent economic sanctions will probably throw Russia into a prolonged economic depression. Russia will increasingly rely on its nuclear deterrent to signal the West to project strength, and its perception that the U.S. is a nation in decline could prompt Russia to engage in more aggressive actions, not only in Ukraine itself, but more broadly in its perceived confrontation with the West. We tell you if we reduce hegemonic power, it will cause increased aggression by Russia, because we tell you when the U.S. reduced its defense spending to the lowest share of GDP since 1940, Russia attacked and occupied their neighbors, corroded institutions they joined, and sought to eliminate their citizens' liberties. If Russia perceives that the U.S. is a nation in decline, it could prompt Russia to engage in more aggressive actions, and not only Ukraine itself, but also more broadly as in its perceived confrontation with the rest. And also on what they said about chemical weapons and nuclear weapons, we tell you that even though Russia may possess a fearful nuclear arsenal, but the risk of Russia using them now is not higher than it would have been in 2008 or 2014, and the probability has always been extraordinarily small. On the fourth contention about China, we de-link this because cooperation with China is already out of question. The Chinese rhetoric that the U.S. is provoking them and their actions are purely defensive is just a justification for the various atrocities being committed by each of them by China. And we turn because we signed the most cooperative treaties in the 1960s and 70s, where we're the global hegemon with no competition. So in order to promote global cooperation, a trustworthy hegemon is needed. So indeed, U.S. security guarantees and its general reputation as a trustworthy nation means cooperation in treaties is higher with the U.S. as a hegemon. Hence, countries are more likely to agree on cooperation in treaties when a hegemonic U.S. is involved. On pandemics, we tell you that COVID-19 vaccines emerged as China, Russia, and the U.S. competed to project influence and donate our loans. So we increased the vaccine distribution. And turn because on climate change, we turn this because the great power competition actually encourages action for climate change. And next, onto
our case, we're collapsing on our second and third contention. Our opponents respond to this by saying this is a time when there is no great power competition. However, we tell you in our case that this great power competition is a competition for all great powers of the world. This means the time frame is since the beginning of the Cold War, and that's when the U.S. developed the nuclear umbrella. They also talk about MID, but we tell you this doesn't apply, as we explain that these nuclearizing states will be in a transition period when they lack the construct capabilities, which where math doesn't apply. And then quickly, I'm gonna finish my sentence. On our third contention, they talk about AI. However, this doesn't apply to our case, as we tell you the U.S. is working on cyber defense, not AI collaboration, and so therefore we urge an affirmative ballot.
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about pandemics first, right? So you give me this response on vaccines. Have for the COVID-19 pandemic, have vaccines prevented deaths from like every single death around the world?
That the purpose of vaccines are to so the purpose of vaccines is kind of just to help to save as many people as possible, and it's not possible for
Yeah, my
everyone.
bad. Sorry, I should rephrase my question. I meant, does everyone inside the world have access to vaccines?
Okay, so first, with or without GPC, that would not be possible. And second, even if everyone did have access, not everybody might be willing to
Okay.
use it.
Can I have a follow-up?
Sure.
So does the US have incentives to develop vaccines without great power competition, without competition at all? Doesn't the US always have an incentive to try to save lives within their own country?
What we're telling you is that with the great power competition, the great power countries are trying to project influence, which will not only benefit their own country but also other countries who have less access to vaccines.
All right, you can have a question.
So, you responded to our third contention by saying something about how AI needs collaboration. Can you explain how that responds?
Actually, that was just overall. So we're telling that everything inside the cyber world, the best way is not to just continue competing. The best way is to start looking ways to cooperate. Because when you start competing against the cyber world, it's not like green technology where you like improve on technology. Right here, it's telling you it's like a continue into a cyber warfare between the U.S. and Russia, which we tell you is going to spur into the next World War III, which proves that this competition is actually bad because it doesn't get anywhere. In fact, it just causes more conflict.
So first, we didn't talk about competition. We're just talking. We're just saying that it spurred U.S. to work on cyber defense. And second, can I just call for the card that says it will cause World War III?
Yeah, sure. But the thing is here, the competition is from great power competition. When we're competing, it's more than just defense, right? That's not what great power competition is. Competition is between these two countries. That's more than just cyber defense. That's kind of more of like offensive. So
But that's not what our third contention is about. So
then how does cyber defense connect with great power competition? Because competition is competition between two countries.
So we tell you that the great power so what we're telling you is that the great power competition has caused the U.S. to increase its cyber defense to protect itself against Russia and China.
But that's different than competition, and that's
starts now. First of all, you're voting us off of our fourth contention on pandemics. We tell you that a pandemic likelihood would increase 3 times over the next decade. This is solely because of the lack of transparency, which is following discoveries of new diseases and the lack of cooperation to even mitigate this crisis. That's why Samuel 19 finds that competition with China will guarantee the next pandemic, which will kill 80 million people and push 490 million people into poverty. And in the future, Superior 21 finds that pandemics can cause other diseases that can completely threaten humanity's entire existence. Their only response to this is that vaccines solve. They do not. They solve way too late in the future. The only way to prevent pandemics in the first place is to solve it when it starts, and that can only happen with cooperation. Lack of transparency is literally the reason why COVID got so bad in the first place. Even though we had vaccines, like 5 million people died, and then they say like pandemics occurred before GPC. Back then, we didn't even have the technology or like the communication to operate, and right now we are fully capable of cooperating. And the risks right now are becoming more and more dangerous and likely, and COVID is the best example. Transparency and cooperation are key. And then let's go on to their turns on like the disinformation. The disinformation literally stopped after some time and then came back in 2016 when Russia spread propaganda when we were using GPC. This disproves their entire like disinformation argument. This means that Russia feels threatened, and that's exactly why they targeted us in 2016. And then on Russia, they just say that Russia is not going to use nuclear weapons. Bergen 22 finds that if Ukraine, fueled by the U.S., keeps on pushing, nuclear war likelihood would increase greatly. And then on cooperation, they just say that competition is better. They say like competition never happened, cooperation never happened. Yes, we did. We already give you like empirics. China and the U.S. literally collaborated together and then stopped because of GPC. But then on weighing, you weigh the round of probability because any other measurement of weighing simply fails. People drive every day with the risk to them is infinitely high, which is their death, and yet the benefits of driving clearly outweigh the small chance of death. We win on probability. We tell you that pandemics will increase threefold in the next few years. They can't even tell you how probable the case is because of MAD. Their poll of arguments never going to happen. States aren't always going to lack second strike capabilities forever, and they can't like prove that when states get nukes, they're just magically going to have a reason to strike a war. And then on their case, on like nuclear umbrella, they missed the argument that the U.S. already had an umbrella over allies before GPC. And then on soft power, like their impacts are literally happening right now, which proves that like their impacts are only happening because of GPC. Thus, there's nowhere to vote but deny.
Again on my first word. Judge, we're collapsing on our second contention. Extend our second contention, which we already did in summary, and our front ones. This is due to the fact that our opponents respond by stating this was during a time when there was no great power competition. However, we tell you in case that GPC is competition for all the great powers of the world. This means we should be looking at a time frame since the beginning of the Cold War, as the Cold War was a competition between two great powers, as we said in rebuttal. This was also when the U.S. developed a nuclear umbrella, making their response invalid. They also say that proliferation causes mutually assured destruction, so mutually assured destruction will apply, but we tell you that no, it does not apply. This is because when one nation attains nuclear weapons, it incentivizes surrounding nations to proliferate as well. We give you two reasons why nuclear proliferation will cause extinction and mutually assured destruction does not apply. First of all, Fair 18 of U Chicago finds that rapidly nuclearizing states often cut corners, making inadvertent launches likely. Second, Koenig 15 writes that new nuclear states go through a transition period in which they lack second strike capabilities. This means that new nuclear states are more willing to use nukes because they have weaker military capabilities, which increases the probability of nuclear exchange, and MAD does not apply. We are in immense danger of extinction. Prioritize our risk of extinction for two reasons. We weigh and tell you that. First, if everyone is dead, nothing can happen, so we short-circuit all their impacts. Next, on to meta weighing. Second, extinction is by far the largest impact. Not only is this 100% irreversible because if everyone dies, nobody can be brought back to life, but this also has an extremely huge magnitude since everyone would die and future generations would never be born. At that point, probability shouldn't even matter. Mapley 07 simplifies that even if extinction events are improbable, the expected values of countermeasures are large, and they include the value of all future lives. The death toll of extinction on the population of Earth is the population of Earth, plus all the descendants of that population who would have otherwise existed. Remember that a percentage of infinity is still infinity, so even if our probability is less than 0.01%, it's not worth taking even the smallest risk, because you are handling the lives of an infinite amount of people. Because our second contention still stands with no reputations in any way. Judge, this is the cleanest place to vote. Nuclear proliferation and essentially extinction is a key aspect that must be considered. We explain to you the magnitude of extinction, so completely ignore all of their impacts and prefer ours. Also, in rebuttal, we completely explain to you why their nuclear war scenario does not apply, because MAD does apply to theirs, but not to ours. On their case, they collapse on their fourth contention on pandemics. On their fourth contention about China and pandemics, we respond overall. Delete. Cooperation with China is out of the question. Chinese rhetoric in the U.S. is that the U.S. is provoking them, and their actions are purely defensive. Specifically on pandemics, we tell you that COVID-19 vaccines have emerged as new public diplomacy instruments in the great power competition, and to compete to project influence through donations or loans on their homegrown vaccines. And inking of vaccine purchases and agreements with countries have less access to vaccines. This shows that GPC actually spurs responses against pandemics. They do not frontline this problem. Judge, you must prioritize any risk of extinction over anything else, which means we cleanly win. We have a clean link chain that leads to extinction that is never refuted, and we refute all of their points in every single way. Even if you don't buy back, our impact still outweighs everything else. This leaves you no place to vote for Aff. Thus, we affirm Affirmative.
Question.
Sure.
Yeah,
All right. So first of all, on your contention on the nuclear umbrella, so basically, you tell me that after the the great power competition existed since beginning of the Cold War, correct?
Yeah.
So but after the Cold War, wasn't the U.S. the only hegemony?
We
Okay, so here's what we're saying. Hold on, let me respond. Here's what we're saying. We're saying that maybe there was a period of time after the Cold War where the U.S. was only a hegemony, where the U.S. was the only hegemony. But we're talking about the Cold War period specifically because this was still a part of the great power competition because there were two great powers.
Yeah, we understand that. But the problem is, after the Cold War, the U.S. was the only hegemony, and there was still allies. The U.S. didn't just drop their allies after great power competition went away. They still had allies. So
what we're telling.
No, what you're saying is correct, but it doesn't apply to this debate because right now we're looking at the Cold War timeframe, and that's when the nuclear umbrella was developed.
Yeah,
So what you're trying to say does not apply to the
understand.
Wait,
The topic isn't talking about how the great power competition, where it was developed, and all those benefits when it was developed. We're talking about right now. We're telling you that if we don't have great power competition right now, we'll still keep the allies, just as after Cold War, we still kept the allies. In fact, the U.S. actually made more allies after the Cold War than it did during the Cold War. That's what our response is.
The thing is, the U.S. developed the nuclear umbrella during the Cold War, and do you have anything that actually proves
That's not how the nuclear umbrella works. This isn't
Hold on, no.
We have a nuclear umbrella over all allies. The U.S. started making allies during the Cold War. However, it made even more allies after the Cold War. That means that the U.S. is still having its umbrella over allies when there is no great power competition.
Do you have a card saying that even in your world where there's no GPC, the U.S. will still have their nuclear umbrella? Because we're telling you that 49 countries, we have a card saying this, 49 countries have the capability to proliferate, but they are not proliferating due to the U.S. nuclear umbrella.
But that's completely...
nuclear umbrella is going to exist in any world, so it doesn't matter.
So we're telling
No,
you...
we're saying that without GPC, those 49 countries who have the capability to proliferate are going to be proliferating.
No, that's not what your card says. Your card says that these allies want to proliferate right now, even during great power competition.
You didn't call for that. You did not call for that card during this round. So are you calling for that card?
We can call for that card after cross. But we want to make something clear. After Cold War, that the U.S. still have an umbrella over the allies.
Are you asking?
Yeah, this is a question for you guys.
Well, right now, yes, we're in a great power competition. Yes,
So there's
That's
periods
not
of great
our
power
question.
competition.
Wait.
There's periods of great power competition, right? The U.S. isn't competing their whole entire span of the whole entire time frame, right? There's gonna be parts where they aren't competing when they're the only hegemony. If the U.S. is the only great power in the world, how is it possible for the U.S. to compete with another great power when there's no other great power? We're telling you that after the Cold War, when
we understand what you're saying, but we're saying that we're not talking about that time period right now. And first of all, we're saying two different things. First of all, we're saying that we're not talking about that time period right now. And yes, even though the nuclear umbrella still existed then when the U.S. was the only hegemony, we're saying that if the U.S. becomes the only hegemony again, that's not going to happen. And we provide you with like this.
No, you can just look. You can yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
All right. Off time roadmap. It'll be our case winning their case. Is anyone not ready? All right, then time for my first word. You'll be voting for the negative team on the pandemics. We tell you that pandemic likelihood will increase 3 times over the next decade. This is solely because of the lack of transparency following the discoveries of new diseases. We tell you that during the COVID-19 pandemic, China wasn't transparent to the US, which is why the disease easily spread into pandemic. That's why Samuel 19 finds that this competition with China will only guarantee the next pandemic which will kill 80 million people and push 409 million people into poverty. And in the future, Superior 21 finds that pandemics can cause other diseases that threaten humans' entirety of existence. This links into extinction. But then they give you two responses. They first tell you that cooperation doesn't work, but we tell you the reason cooperation doesn't work is because of great power competition right now. Their evidence is right now, which is during great power competition, proving that cooperation isn't working because of GPC. But the second they tell about vaccines, but how what Katie tells us in the summary is that, however, we told that at the beginning it's better to prevent than like try to solve for only a portion of the whole entire pandemic. At this point, you can vote for that negative team on 2 terms versus probability. We tell that pandemics are more likely to occur and we can see them materialize. If there isn't any transparency between the US and China, then the likelihood is increasing 3 times. On nuclear war, we see that new nuclear states have been proliferating over the whole entire Earth's existence, but no nuclear war has ever occurred. This percent the probability is really low because when the US proliferated and the Cold War is a perfect example, no nuclear war never happened because of mutual assured destruction. But then on time frame, we tell you that pandemics are easily to materialize very quickly, just as COVID-19, and materialize within 1 year or less than 1 year. But many countries, even proliferating, aren't able to acquire them in time and aren't able to make the nuclear weapons, which proves that their time frame is very, very risky. But onto their case. They drop us one crucial response that it's never ever frontline. We tell you that Beijing and Moscow are targeting allies because they want to hurt the US, which is why their own card of 49 countries want to proliferate right now. It doesn't matter if we didn't call it, we already know the card. But the second we tell that proliferation is good because nuclear war never occurred at the point where they're probably super low and it's on our side when many nuclear states have already proliferated, but many people can't probably make a nuclear bomb. But second, they aren't gonna bomb each other because they know that they will also it will just cause extinction, like they say. But pandemics is very likely, it's very hard to prevent because diseases are always there, which is like our probability and our magnitude linked to extinction is the best way to vote. Vote on pandemics for NAG. Thank you.
Brief off-time roadmap. It's gonna be our case, weighing their case, and there's just gonna be pieces of weighing throughout. Alright. So time starts now. Judge, we're going for our second contention as we extend our second contention in our front lines. Our opponent's 2 responses has 2 responses. The first response is that there is the nuclear rebellion during a time that there is no great power competition. However, we tell you that the great power competition is a competition for all the great powers in the world, and this means that we should be looking at a time frame since the beginning of the Cold War, as the Cold War is a competition between 2 great powers. Also, and this is when the U.S. developed the nuclear umbrella, making this a unique argument. They also respond by saying that there's that NAD applies. However, we tell you that this doesn't apply, and we give you 2 reasons. Because first is that rapidly nuclearizing states often cut corners, which makes inadvertent launches likely. And we also tell you that new nuclear states go through a transition period where they lack second strike capabilities when NAD isn't in place. And then they talk about how 49 states currently want to proliferate. We tell you no, that 49 states are able to proliferate, but they are not, because the United States has the nuclear umbrella. And you should prioritize our risk of extinction for 2 reasons. We weigh and tell you that first, if everyone is dead, nothing can happen, so we short circuit every single one of their impacts. And second, extinction is by far the largest impact, and not only is it 100% irreversible, because if everyone dies, nobody can be brought back to life, but it also has an extremely huge magnitude, since everyone would die and future generations will never be born. At that point, probabilities shouldn't even matter, as even if extinction events are improbable, the expected values of countermeasures could be large, as they include the value of all future lives. Remember that the percentage of infinity is still infinity, so even if probability is less than 0.01%, it is not worth taking even the smallest risk when you're handling the lives of an infinite amount of people. Next, under their case, it collapsed in the 4th contention about pandemics. We already responded to this, and they did not, and then I tell you that cooperation with China is out of question, and we tell you that COVID-19 vaccines have and the great power countries have been competing to distribute COVID-19 vaccines, which has spurred the response against pandemics. So we turn this in and this means that we win our case, their case, and the impact rate, which and our impact takes out all of theirs. So this means you should prefer our extinction impact, and you should prioritize the risk of extinction over everything else, which means we clearly win. Judge, this leaves you no place to vote for Aff. So thus, we urge an affirmative ballot.
Great round, guys.
Great round.
That was so good. That was a great way to end the entire competition.
That was a great round. Yeah.
That was heated. This round is being recorded, right? So shout out to Dia, Aeon, and Natalie, because we use their extinction weighing.
Sounds good. Okay. Awesome. I voted affirmative. I thought that the impact defense on the pandemics was convincing enough. In addition to I thought it was a really smart move to kind of. I didn't think that it was initially the best move, but I thought later on, looking back on it, that sort of forwarding and front loading this sort of impact framing was really helpful in how I viewed the debate and kind of how I saw the debate. but yeah, but to me, I really enjoyed the fact that y'all had like two scenarios specifically for like the nuclear war impact, both like the instability among like rising states and like those that like will just use nuclear weapons if they don't have second strike capabilities. To me, that was like pretty convincing, and there didn't seem to be a whole lot of pushback on the internal link chain. Um, and so that's kind of the way I voted. But I really enjoyed like everyone's speeches, and I thought like everyone was really good about giving a concise speech.